Like and subscribe now, or you're gonna have bad luck this week.
There's no such thing as a safe emergency airplane landing, especially if it has to land on water. Landing a plane on water has its own special term now. It's called ditching, and this task is one of the hardest for pilots, mainly because it's almost impossible to train pilots to deal with this situation, especially if we're talking about back in 1956 when there were no training simulations available. Fortunately, a water landing doesn't always end in complete devastation, and very often it can result in a successful landing with minimal injuries. Join us as we show you some stories in which heroic pilots were able to turn seemingly devastating situations into great tales. Let's begin. Number 5. Lion Air Boeing 737. Back in 2013, there was an incident that no resident of Bali will ever forget. Pilot errors, inadequate crew trainings, and lapses in emergency response procedures led to a plane crashing into the Sea of Bali in April 2013. Fortunately, none of the 108 passengers and crew died in the incident, which took place as heavy rain affected visibility for a Boeing 737-800 on a scheduled flight from Bandung. The crash occurred as the jet descended rapidly toward the Indonesian island's Ngurah International Airport. The 24-year-old first officer flying the plane at the time was unable to see the runway in the downpour during the descent. The aircraft's pilots disengaged the autopilot and flew the plane manually. By the time the 48-year-old captain decided to order a go-around for a second approach to the runway, the aircraft was at an altitude of only 20 feet. If you've ever been in a plane, you know that is very low. The minimum altitude for a Boeing 737-800 go-around is 50 feet. Both pilots also failed to adequately follow the airline's operating manual, which gave clear instructions on what to do when faced with the situation. 4 people suffered serious injuries, and the aircraft, which had been in service for less than 2 months with the airline, was written off. Lion Air was one of the fastest growing airlines at the time, with hundreds of Airbus and Boeing jets on order. Since January 2002, the low-cost carrier has suffered 8 serious accidents, with 6 aircraft written off. We're just happy no one lost their life on this flight. Number 4. US Airways Flight 1549. Our next water landing is truly an incredible one and has been a marvel to many ever since it happened, making its captain a true celebrity among the media, the government, and the families that were involved. Known as the Miracle on the Hudson, this is the incident that inspired the film Sully, in which Tom Hanks played the heroic captain. Leaving from LaGuardia on January 15, 2009, skies were clear and things seemed to be going well until shortly after the takeoff, when the pilot's window was covered in feathers and wings as a flock of geese had hit the plane. Those on board heard loud noises and saw smoke coming from the engines, which incited a lot of panic on the flight. Both engines were badly damaged, and the pilots desperately attempted to restart the engines before finally deciding to return to the airport. However, a little while later, they realized that they were not in a condition to make it to the airport. Sully then came over the intercom and uttered the words that no traveler wants to hear ever: "Brace to impact." With no power and a heavy aircraft, Sully glided over the Hudson before finally making an impact just off the coast of New Jersey. Though during the panic, a passenger opened the rear door, partially flooding the main cabin, all the passengers were eventually evacuated out of the flooded aircraft safely. After making sure that all were evacuated, the pilot then exited himself. Fortunately, only minor injuries were reported, and the landing was incredibly well done, especially considering the lack of power and failing engines. Captain Sullenberg was commended for his bravery and capabilities and was even invited to the inauguration by then newly elected President Barack Obama. Number 3. Ethiopian Airlines Flights 961. Hauntingly caught on video, a vacationing couple looks up from their beach chairs and out to the sea only to see a plane fall from the sky and collide into the ocean only 500 meters from the shore. It all began on the 23rd of November 1996 when 3 men hijacked the cockpit with an axe and fire extinguisher that they had stolen from the airport. The men were said to be intoxicated, and they threatened to blow up the plane if the pilots didn't obey them, as they claimed that there were 11 of them. The men then forced the first officer into a cabin and announced on the intercom that if anyone tried to interfere, they would use a bomb to blow up the entire plane. but experts later concluded that there was no such explosive material on board. The criminals then demanded the plane to be flown to Australia, despite the warnings of the captain that the plane didn't have enough fuel for even a part of the journey. The captain then secretly headed southward where he tried to land the plane at an airport located on Comoros, a group of islands on the coast of Africa. Unfortunately, a fight broke out between the hijackers and the captain, and he couldn't land as he lost sight of the airport. While still fighting with the hijackers, the captain attempted a water landing just off the coast. Although on this approach, one of the wings struck a coral reef, and that caused the entire aircraft to twist in the air as it slammed into the water. As the airplane broke apart, many people unfortunately pulled their life jackets while still within the plane, trapping them within and drowning as the plane sank. Tourists who were on the nearby beach sprang into action and helped to save the lives of many on board. In the end, 50 of the passengers and some of the crew members, including the pilot and the co-pilot, survived, while the hijackers all died. Number 2. Pan Am Flight 6. Leaving from sunny Honolulu and headed to San Francisco, Pan Am Flight 6 left the runway piloted by Captain Richard Ogg. Around halfway through the duration of the flight, the plane gained altitude, and as the power input dropped, one of the engines began to overspeed, which means when an engine spins faster than it was designed to. The first officer, George Hacker, attempted to slow the engine down by trying all that he could before the captain finally cut the oil supply to the engine. The plane then started to fly too slow and started descending, which then increased to load, leading to one of the other engines failing. The increased drag of the aircraft then forced them to use more fuel to provide the excess power that the engines would need. This, however, meant that they would run out of fuel soon and would not be able to complete their journey to San Francisco. The Coast Guard was contacted, and Flight 6 was headed towards the nearest Coast Guard ship, where it began circling in the air. The captain wanted to wait until daylight so that they could see better and land safely. Eventually, they moved all of the passengers towards the front of the plane, and the captain made his landing at 6:15 a.m. The waves spun the plane around and damaged the nose and ripped out the tail section. To add more to the misfortune of the passengers that day, one of the life rafts failed to inflate, but the nearby Coast Guard was able to transfer all the passengers along with the crew onto the vessel with only minor injuries being reported. Eventually, the passengers completed their journey by sea, all thanks to the level heads of the pilots and their great planning that no lives were lost. Number 1. Tunenter Flight 1153. This time our story begins the night before the takeoff. As the technicians were performing maintenance on the aircraft, some of the workers accidentally installed the wrong fuel indicator into the wrong plane, a smaller, less fuel-heavy one, so that when it was time to refuel the aircraft, it was filled without enough fuel for the flight. As the plane was on its way to North Africa flying through the air, it suddenly lost power to both of the engines, causing the entire plane to descend at a rapid pace. The pilots were confused as the incorrectly installed indicator wasn't showing the usable fuel, and though they desperately attempted to restart the engine, the crew was unable to do so. That is when the captain called for an emergency landing in Sicily, gliding in the air in an attempt to land at the airport. Unfortunately, the aircraft couldn't make it to the runway, and that's when they decided to go for water landing off the coast. The plane hit the water at the speed of 145 miles per hour and broke into pieces upon impact, leading to the eventual death of 16 people. However, 23 people survived, including the pilots, and they were rescued by the emergency ships located nearby. Now, it's at this point that we should really remind you that the probability of you dying or having an accident while traveling by air is really quite low. In fact, experts predict that on a simple flight, take for example Virgin Atlantic Airbus A330, your chances of dying are 1 in 5 million, which means you'll have to take that flight every day for 14,760 years to meet some dangerous accident. So don't let it deter you, because flights are pretty awesome and relatively a safer mode of travel than other means. Though it must be horrifying to be on such an unfortunate flight, tell us in the comments how panicked or calm you think you would be if you were on one of them. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.